Welcome to everybody joining us for this exciting event with a presentation dedicated to Hawaiian royal portraits and diplomacy. And I'm really delighted to host two wonderful speakers today, Aloha Johnston and Kate LeMay, and I will introduce them in a moment. My name is Alice Christoph, and I'm the lead curator for the exhibition Hawaiʻi, A Kingdom Crossing Oceans, which opened at the British Museum just a few weeks ago. And it's been really exciting to see the show up and running and to welcome so many visitors here at the British Museum, but also to see so many of you engaging online. I'm mentioning this exhibition because obviously the portraits and the idea of portraiture that we'll be discussing tonight is very much embedded in the fabric of this show. The exhibition that just opened a few weeks ago is centering the complex and long-lasting relationship between the Hawaiian Kingdom and the United Kingdom. And this show is timed to mark 200 years since a series of events, including the visit of Liholiho, King of Hawaii, and Queen Kamāmalu to the UK. And so this story of their journey, Queen Kamāmalu, Liholiho, and a delegation of 10 is represented and explained at the core of this exhibition in the second section of the show, truly forming the center core of this show. And in this center core, the very core of this core is a pair of portraits realized by the British court artist John Hayter and representing Liholiho and Kamāmalu. So both in the exhibition and today in this presentation, we felt it was really important to center portraiture as an important tool for diplomacy and as a medium that carries a really strong message and a form of expression of Hawaiian sovereignty in this context. Before we welcome our wonderful speakers, we should say a few words perhaps about this really epic journey across a couple of oceans that Liholiho, Kamāmalu, and their royal delegation took, starting in 1823 and reaching the UK in 1824. So what happened there? Liholiho became king of Hawaii in 1819, following a battle for succession. He was entrusted with the care of government and eventually became mo'i, or king of Hawaii. In 1822, Liholiho received a ship, a gift from the British Crown, one that had been promised to his father, who was called Kamehameha I, by Captain George Vancouver back in the late 18th century. It took a very long time for that ship to be built. It was built in Sydney, and then finally, again in 1822, it arrived in Hawaiian waters. Liholiho, when he receives this gift, writes to the British Crown to thank this country for this gift. But unfortunately, the Crown does not respond to this letter. And so in 1823, following the passing of his own mother, High Chiefess Keopuolani, Liholiho is going to decide to embark on this journey to the UK to solidify an alliance and seek protection from the British Crown. So in November 1823, Liholiho, Queen Kamāmalu, and a delegation of 10 will gather in the Hawaiian archipelago and depart from Honolulu for this long journey at sea, embarking on a whaling ship called the Eagle. And they are going to embark on this journey that will take over 5 months at sea and include a stop via Brazil. So they leave again Honolulu in November of 1823. They make their way down across the Pacific aboard this whaling ship. They go all the way down to the Tierra del Fuego, which you can see here on this map, and then up to Rio de Janeiro, where they stop and meet with the Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. And in fact, they present a feathered cloak, a Hawaiian feathered cloak, to the Emperor of Brazil. They also meet with the British consul to the UK and present him with a feathered cloak. And then finally, they make their way up the Atlantic to the north and arrive in Portsmouth in May of 1824. As they arrive in Portsmouth, they're quickly taken to London via carriage. And in London, they're going to await an audience with King George IV, the king of this country. While awaiting an audience, they're taken around the city. They're hosted by Frederick Bing, their host in London and a member of the Foreign Office. They have their expenses covered. They go to the theater, they go to the opera, they visit the British Museum. In fact, we know that they came to the British Museum and saw a certain number of ancestral works that are on display in the exhibition at the museum. And while awaiting this audience, they also have their portraits drawn by British artist, British court artist, John Hayter. This is a really important moment in this journey, also one that, announces obviously the sovereignty of the kingdom and projects a sovereign image of Hawaii, a nation at the table with modern nations. It's also a tragic one because it is likely that while the ali'i were being, or royals were being, their portraits were being made, they probably were incubating measles. So the important aspect of this voyage as well is that as they reached the UK, the entire delegation while in London caught measles, and the king and queen, Liholiho and Kamāmalu, will pass away in London in 1824. So our exhibition reckons with and marks this moment. It goes beyond that, and it also tells the story of the audience that finally took place with George IV, with the remaining members of the delegation, but I won't go too far into this tonight. The key here is that during this voyage and during this moment in London in particular, royal portraiture is going to play a very important role again in projecting this image of Hawaii as a sovereign nation at the table with nations across the world in the UK. And this is the topic that our wonderful speakers, Kate LeMay and Healoha Johnson, are going to explore in this presentation. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for this presentation. The first speaker is Healoha Johnston. She is Director of Cultural Resources and Curator for Hawaii and Pacific Arts and Culture at the Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum in Honolulu. Healoha's exhibitions and research projects explore connections between historic visual culture and contemporary art, with a particular focus on the social, political underpinnings that inform those relationships. The second speaker is Kate LeMay, who is the director of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center of the Army War College, the premier archive of the U.S. Army. LeMay served as a historian and curator at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery prior to joining the Army War College. And in this context, Kate co-curated the exhibition 1898 Imperial Visions and Revisions. And this exhibition studied, amongst many other things, the Congressional Joint Resolution to annex Hawaii in 1898. I'm very pleased to have both of them here today and to dive into this topic that is a fascinating topic of Hawaiian portraiture and diplomacy. Over to you, Healoha.
Thank you so much, Alice, for having us here today. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to talk about some of the pieces in a deep dive format that are otherwise on view in the gallery. I'd like to start off by talking about some of the portraits that would have preceded the portraits completed during the visit in London. And the ones that I wanted to focus on here at our beginning are portraits of King Kamehameha I. So King Kamehameha I, of course, was he is recognized as an incredible political strategist. By the time he was imaged in these portraits before you, he had, interacted with people from all around the world because, of course, the world was coming to Hawaii by this point. The first watercolor on the left is by Louis Corris, who came to Hawaii actually in 1816 and then developed a series of artworks based on those early sketches and drawings. And so this watercolor was produced in 1817. So there are records describing how Corris interacted with Kamehameha. And, chorus expected Kamehameha to come for his portrait sitting dressed in uh, something perhaps more, I think, befitting in terms of what chorus would have expected, how Kamehameha would have wanted to project his image to the world. There is notoriously a yellow ahu'ula made of hundreds and thousands of tiny yellow bird feathers, and it glistened like gold gems in the sunlight wrapped around Kamehameha's body. And I think people, including the artist, would have loved to have been able to be the one who portrayed him wearing that. And instead, Kamehameha came in a red vest. And this was amongst the type of diplomatic gifts that Kamehameha would have received. By this time, he had received garments of all sorts as diplomatic gifts from different governments and their different crewmen as they came to Hawaii, and of all things to choose a red vest. But red in Hawaii is very significant and is frequently associated with ali'i. And so although the artist may not have seen this as a color that was befitting of King Kamehameha certainly thought so. And this likeness then ended up being reproduced over and over and over again. And so what we see is the second image, this was a watercolor based on Chorus's first image, but painted in 1853. And then the last oil on canvas is a portrait created by an artist who we actually don't know their name, but we do know that it circulated as part of the China trade. And these Kamehameha portraits showed up in the China trade as early as 1818. So you have to imagine only 2 years after Chorus's first sketch, this portrait of Kamehameha is already circulating around the world. And it could have been, before Mikelemi's painting, or it could have been after. We don't know. But what we do know is that there were artists, visiting Hawaii from Europe and different countries in Europe, and then China, all basing their images and continuing to circulate these initial images of Hawaii by way of the ali'i through portraiture. And Christina Helmick at De Young Museum and my colleague here, Leah Caldera at Bishop Museum, have looked into the way that Hawaiian featherwork in particular has shown itself in portraits, and the way that people were fascinated by the just incredible sight of seeing these full garments wrapped around Native Hawaiians as they encountered them, not only in Hawaii, but as Native Hawaiians then traveled around the world. So, for example, Kaiana went to China in the 1780s. So these images actually preceded the ones that I showed you first of King Kamehameha. But what you can see here is that they were published and reproduced. They were published initially, I think, in 1789 or 1790, documenting Captain Portlock's visit to an area that was historically called Canton in China. And you can see an interaction between Kaiana and Captain Portlock as the center image. And the artist who rendered this, I don't think, was quite proficient in capturing the details of how featherwork fell. Nevertheless, what we can see is that the cape very likely was an ahu'ula made up of Hawaiian featherwork. And I say this because Christina Helmick, researched deeply this particular image and found documentation of their interaction in terms of archival written records. And there are notes that describe how Kaiana was wearing European pants and an ahu'ula, but there are also records that indicate that his preference was Hawaiian malo and featherwork. There was so much exchange happening. And a lot of that was happening by way of diplomacy, but a lot of it was happening by way of trade, cross currents, human movement and migration. And, fabrics were coming into Hawaii, and as Hawaiians were traveling abroad, they were seeing, different types of textiles, and of course, incorporating them into their own sense of style. So, Kate, can I ask you to talk a little bit more about self-fashioning and how that shows up in portraiture?
Thank you, Hiloha. That was I always love looking at Kaiana's wearing of the featherwork, especially in China. I think that's such a beautiful story, and he clearly made such an impact. Um, and I like to shout out to David Chang's The World and All the Things Upon It, because his writing about those explorations was really moving for me when I was trying to understand self-imaging and how Hawaiian royalty really used their beautiful, the feather work to make such an impression. And that self-imaging is something that Hawaiian royals were very, very self-conscious of in their presentation. So really they wanted to project their nobility and in a way use their image as part of their diplomacy in 1824 when Liholiho and Kamāmalu went to London. And here you can see two lithographs. These are portraits of Liholiho on the left and Kamāmalu on the right. And what's really beautiful about these portraits is that they upset expectations. So kind of like Choris when he was making the work of Kamehameha wearing the vest, I think that some people expected Liholiho and Kamāmalu to be wearing native Hawaiian dress. But what's interesting in these portraits is that they made the decision to present themselves in Western wear. What you see is the jacket is a hussar style jacket that Liholiho is wearing. And he's got his hair fashioned in this beautiful Brutus kind of, styling where the hair is brushed forward. And when I was studying these images, I was looking very carefully at the artist's hand and the kind of the way in which you can read the artist's hand so much more easily on a lithographic print than you can with like an etching, which is you really have to press hard and make these very specific incisions when artists are working with etchings, whereas with the lithographic, working on stone and using the properties of oil and water, the hand and the flair of the artist is much more easily caught. And that actually helps us now reading this image to see how the piping of the hussar style jacket is actually not Brandenburg piping, which is that really tightly coiled kind of ribbon that takes a long time to actually fabricate and then make. Instead, you see a ribbon that is fashioned to look like that Brandenburg piping. And that's what's sort of those zigzag lines down the center of the chest of Liholiho's jacket. And when I realized that this jacket was made out of ribbon, that is with the piping, that is actually a clue for us to understand Liholiho's experience while he was in London. Because if you're having something made very quickly, you're going to choose ribbon. You're not going to choose the Brandenburg piping that takes a lot longer. So we know that probably, we can make a safe assumption. Hiloha, I think you might want to jump in to kind of muse on this, but one of the things that I was thinking of is that, the royals arrived in London and then were thinking about, okay, well, what am I going to wear? And so they wanted to partake and explore and have fun with the London clothing and styles. And for the portrait that they sat for John Hayter, which was a lithographic drawing originally, they wore these wonderful Western outfits. And so Kamāmalu's hair is in these tight curls at her temple, and she's wearing this headdress. And Native Hawaiian headdress is very, very beautiful. And the maioli with the feather work is just outstanding and so breathtaking. But she instead chose to wear these ostrich feathers that are kind of fun because they create the same very large silhouette and halo. But I can see how the ali'i is thinking more about kind of self-presentation and diplomacy and cosmopolitanism, and the fact that they can they're fluent in all these different ways of presenting themselves. So that's what I'm reading from these portraits. And then if we go to the next one, I just want to very briefly make a remark about the next slide. These are notes about how the portrait was made. And so if you look closely to the writing, it says by authority drawn on stone from life by John Hayter. So by authority is obviously a marketing ploy, but drawn from life is a really, really important thing to note in portraiture because it's also a recording of a social interaction. There are ways in which they're talking to and having social interactions with the artist. But Hiloha, do you want to jump in?
Thank you for that, Kate. Yeah, I think, your discussion and the visual analysis about the garments that they're wearing in the previous slide, hearken a lot of the research that's been done around how, the people in Hawaii, prepared the ali'i for their travel before they left and headed to London in 1824. So there's a lot of, discussion and records about how people, assembled their dresses. But then there's an incredible archive of material that talks about how when they arrived in London, whether or not their suitcases came or not, or, their big, traveling chests that they would have, used in the 1800s arrived in time. Certainly, we do know that they were hosted to an incredible level by the British government.
Yeah.
And it's really fun to read, Kamana's writing, Noinoilana Arista's writing, where they talk about how the way that, when they were there, they were taken shopping. And Hawaiians take hosting very seriously. So when people were coming from around the world to Hawaii, the ali'i were hosting. And so when they went to Europe, of course, they gladly accepted that same gesture. And I agree with you in terms of being able to identify the way that these were likely made while they were there. And, with the ability then for the ali'i to respond to these two locations on opposite ends of the world, really, crafting garments in Hawaii and then coming to London, situating themselves within a new style and fashion, having the opportunity to do precisely that because of the gifting and diplomatic hosting that they experienced. And then, their ability to sit based on their own sense of agency for an artist who documented that interaction from life.
What's also interesting to me, and Hiloha and I have talked about this, is how Liholiho and Kamāmalu chose to be in Western dress, but their friends and part of the royal party, Boki and Liliha, his wife, Boki was the prime minister in Hawaii. We think they chose to present themselves in an ahu'ula and the maioli, and the beautiful necklace that is made out of human hair. And I'm like obsessed over these necklaces because they are strands of braids of human hair, and then they wear the whalebone as the pendant. That's called the Leoniho Palaoa. And I'm familiar with them from visiting a variety of collections of Native Hawaiian objects, but I was really delighted to see that Liliha chose to, or is pictured in wearing this necklace, because it really does complement the ahu'ula and the mahioli headdress. There's a way that in the self-fashioning and the way that the portrait portrays this couple specifically, if you were to compare it to Liholiho and Kamāmalu, you can see even more of a compare and contrast of their agency. I'd love to hear, Hiloha, what your thoughts are on this too. But when you see the three images together, I think the self-agency and the decision-making and maybe the interactions that the sitters had with the Hayter, John Hayter, the artist, really comes to life in how they are portrayed. And we should also acknowledge that Boki and Liliha's portrait was made after a painting. So there's also kind of a setup of different mediums and how they have had their own afterlives, right? Because Liholiho and Kamāmalu's original portraits were lithographs, whereas Boki and Liliha's original portrait is not what we're looking at here. It was a painting by John Hayter. Hey, Loha, what are your thoughts?
When I look at this, I wonder, why it is that Boki has the ahu'ula draped in front of him in this manner, which is different from how it would have been worn in actual practice. And so there is a gesture, to really render the ahu'ula in close association with Boki. So the pattern and the drape and everything seems to be a key factor as opposed to having it around his back. In the full portrait, what we're able to see with Liliha is that she's wearing what looks like a pa'u, a skirt that wraps around the body. And, whether that was made out of kapa, which would have been, the customary fabric, or if it was made out of cotton or calico, it's hard to tell, but the pattern, the stripe patterns, would be pretty consistent with the type of garment that could have been, made in kapa kapa made out of alke. Interestingly, Liliha is also wearing earrings, and she has on a lepo'o, and if those are leaves or feathers, it's hard to tell. But that headdress also is a little bit different from the lepo'o that she probably would have worn at home. So without question, they are in this portrait depicted in a manner that includes far more Native Hawaiian status references and a lexicon that indicates their status as ali'i, but there are these asymmetries that also indicate the way that perhaps they were working with the artist in order to include the garments, the way that they were perhaps integrating their own comfort level with various elements such as, these different jewelries and accessories.
I love that. And I feel just the group together, you can really get a sense of how they're commanding their own image. And maybe, like I said, it might have been brokered with the artist, but right in the Hiloha, you were talking about how the ahu'ula is kind of flipped, and there's some disparity with maybe what you would have expected. But who were buying these prints? Do you know? This is something that I'd love to explore more. There was a market, but Hiloha, the Honolulu Museum of Art, has has the wax bust portrait. I mean, there's a lot of likeness that these portraits inspired of the royals, and I'm just thinking that beyond this sort of caricature market, these are serious portraits. So who was buying these?
There's a lot of documentation about how from the very beginning, that portrait of King Kamehameha in the red vest, as soon as Hawaiians knew that the ali'i had been rendered, people were so curious to see it, very interested in being able to, have a piece that portrays the ali'i, but also to have themselves rendered. And so, throughout the 1800s, itinerant artists were coming to Hawaii, and people were very actively commissioning artists. And in fact, the newspapers would post when an artist had arrived. And so there was an active consumption of visual art by Native Hawaiians living in Hawaii who both wanted to image themselves and then have images of the people around them and, of course, of the ali'i. And, later the same thing was happening with photography. The ali'i were very savvy in self-marketing, very savvy. They understood how these things were moving around the world because, people were coming to port all the time from different places. They were being gifted portraits, and so then they were returning the gesture and gifting portraits. And locally, people were acquiring these. And, they, as we'll see as we continue, artists then based their own interpretations on these early renderings from life. At the same time, though, during their visit to London, during the ali'i's visit to London, there were political satirical cartoons that were created because of, the lexicon of colonialism, ultimately, the visual lexicon of colonialism. And, this is one aspect of visual diplomacy where there's absolutely a dynamic, a political dynamic, a power dynamic that exists, and who is setting the terms of that diplomacy. And I think what we were looking at before with the way that Boki and Liliha, Kamāmalu and Liholiho both all kind of decided how to navigate these determined diplomatic spheres in their own unique way. And when they came to London, there was this pre-existing typecasting that existed. And so you see throughout these different images the way that the ali'i are dressed in featherwork. It looks quite obviously different. I mean, it wasn't meant to be accurate in any real sense, but they reinforce racist stereotypes and, support a dominant power structure where the ali'i do not have self determination or their own sense of agency. But what we see continuously is that despite these types of images that circulated through publications and were acquired by a lot of different folks at different tiers within social structure, the ali'i continued to use those mediums or those media, and in fact embraced new technology in order to be able to see their images circulate quicker, more broadly, both, validated by the past as their genealogy indicates, but 100% part of the future by way of these technologies that they so readily adopted. Here they are, the ali'i being, depicted. If you look at the ka'iana, there are engravings, and then as technology changes, we have the ali'i circulating their images by way of lithographs and these different forms of portraiture. And did you want to pick up there on anything, Kate?
So one of the things that really struck me when I was studying these caricatures is how they were consumed by various tiers of society. And that was what Hawaiian was saying. Like, the king actually had books like this made, and King George IV was looking and kind of consuming these books. And this is sort of what people did, for fun and to have a laugh. That's why they are so important, even though they're so violent. I think they are important to kind of keep as registers of social, attitudes and ideas at that moment. Because if you go to the next slide, obviously Native Hawaiians did not embrace those caricatures, and they were going forward with their own fashioning of, commanding their own experiences through portraiture. And those bodies that they represented, the Hawaiian Islands, they're very much in 1824 on a mission to ensure that they continued to be autonomous and to have sovereignty. And so part of their diplomatic mission was to entreat George IV to back them, to, recognize their sovereignty. And as one royal to another, they were able to have those conversations with a variety of different monarchs. And as Alice outlined, unfortunately, Liholiho and Kamāmalu died of measles, but Boki and Liliha were able to continue that mission, the diplomatic envoy. And Hiloha, you have probably thought about this very deeply too, with like the way that portraiture has carried through that mission. even through to today. And if we advance the slides, I think we'll see some more of the images that were made to honor this voyage and to perpetuate the legacy of the diplomacy.
Thank you, Kate. This was one of the portraits that then came back with those who returned the bodies of the ali'i who had passed on this trip to London. And we can see here that what is now sculpted of wax and wood and framed in this gold gilded, frame portrait of Liholiho is based likely on these portraits that Hayter produced. And so we see how the movement across material and media, we see that ends up becoming a reference for yet another diplomatic gift from the King of England to the ali'i at home as he's returning Liholiho and Kamāmalu back to Hawaii.
I think we're both obsessed with this glass work. I know that I actually didn't know very much about the Arago portrait that was made of Liholiho. And so when I saw this lead glass medallion, and I think it's a collector's item, right? So it pops up every now and then in auction houses. And I know the Honolulu Museum of Art has its own. But I was, really struck by the different medium and the preciousness of this medallion, to wear it or to keep it and to have it close to one's body. And it's portable, and it's obviously this very beautiful homage of a portrait in the silhouette form. But it recalls that wax bust that Aloha you were just speaking about. So I'd love to hear too, like what were your thoughts when you first saw this object?
The reference to Arago and the print, of course, and then, it reminded me, though, of the fact that Liholiho had not always sat for portraits dressed in European wear. Liholiho across, his short life was depicted wearing, a malo, a jacket. He was quite, I think he definitely had his own sense of style, but he was quite savvy in how he utilized fashion and style in order to interact, in these different circumstances. And yeah, both the framed bust and then this glass piece, incredible tokens by which the ali'i could be remembered in a physical form. It is, I think, that bust, the framed portrait, although there are other wax busts, I mean, that one stands alone, in the way that it was meant to be both a diplomatic gesture from one government to another as they, returned a king who had passed to his homeland and the queen as well. But then also the way that, his image ended up becoming fortified through this particular sculpture or this relief. And then you can see, through the smaller scale example, this is something that more people would have been able to carry and to be able to circulate as we know they did. And, just the viability of these images moving between countries, between archipelagos, across oceans and continents, and how people would have collected or preferred, whether it be a wall-mounted piece like one of the prints or a painting. As we know, a lot of these portraits were then painted by artists in France and then turned back into prints by Lahaina Luna, the press. And so these images, they moved across different formats. And it's such an indication of the way that they were significant to the people of Hawaii and to the world, and that they continued to move across different formats. And they continue to move across different formats today. Here we are, 2026, and that portrait of King Kamāmalu II. You can see Kamāmalu's portrait there, as well as Hawaiian featherwork spread across, contemporary critical attention. It's fantastic.
I love it. Their legacy lives on.
Last, I think it's important that we close on just an installation shot of the gallery, because I think it's an incredible thing to see the way that an exhibition in England still is something that's meaningful and important, and their portraits are center, surrounded by Hawaiian featherwork. And, how many people from Hawaii want to be able to go and have already gone to see an exhibition such as this?
It's a beautiful installation, and I mean, the countless hours of curating and hard work by the British Museum. What strikes me is that the conversation and the portraits, the various, I guess, portraits that you can see, even obviously in the lithographs, but in the featherwork and the ahula, that were significant by the wearers themselves. So I'm really, really excited and very, proud of this exhibition. That I'm so glad it happened. And Hilo, I know that you were talking about currying some of the objects back. How many objects were you able to lend to the exhibit?
The British Museum requested 3 pieces. They were the 3 pieces that came as gifts originally from England as part of the, journey back home from the Hawaiʻi's voyage. And, that was, a beautiful way, I think, for us to be included and to just hearken to this connection that has existed between Hawaii and England, largely through a diplomatic relationship, but one that became, of course, deeply personal, and it was one that was maintained by Ali'i across generations. And so that's what I mean when I say personal, is that the kings and queens of both countries, England and Hawaii, considered it a priority to maintain that relationship as their successors, assumed the throne. And yeah, so it was an incredible honor to be able to lend. And my colleague Leah Caldera, who played, a much more integral role to the exhibition, and it was just a wonderful thing for us to be part of.
I really love this installation, and it's so beautiful, the visual conversation between the various objects. And I do know that there's some significance in the colors. So I'd love, Aloha, if you could explain a little bit about the yellow and the red and the bird feathers. And then back to the portraits, if you don't mind, could you revisit the reactions of the Hawaiians to the news of the death of Liholiho and Kamāmalu? Thanks.
The featherwork, the association, so the Ali'i are the divine mediators, between the realms, and the spiritual realm and the earthly realm. And so the birds, which fly in the forests at very high elevations, had an association then with the Ali'i. And so the forest birds that were, their feathers were incorporated into garments that then signified the Ali'i, but then style changes and fashion evolution. So, Hawaiians ended up introduced feathers to Hawaiian featherwork. And as those other feathers became more accessible due to ecological impacts, as the Hawaiian birds were going extinct, they would dye feathers to look like these feathers in some cases, and in other cases not, like, peacock feathers, and other feathers end up, chicken feathers even become utilized within different garments. And, featherwork is still a very prominent aspect of Hawaiian culture today. So people wear them, as hat bands, as leipo'o. And, a subsequent trip to England by another Ali'i, Queen Kapi'olani, decades later, ends up wearing a peacock dress that shows up all over the London news and the media. And, there's incredible documentation of the way that featherwork worn by a Hawaiian, but doesn't necessarily look like this, continues to have an influence and, draws attention from foreign crowds. When these particular, when King Kamāmalu II and Queen Kamāmalu, when they came home, there's certainly records of how they were mourned, and then how those aboard the Blonde were hosted in Hawaii as a gesture for having cared for the ali'i on their way back home.
The Blonde is the HMS Blonde, the ship.
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah, and so again, just I look at this exhibition as an opportunity for Bishop Museum and the British Museum to, in some ways, continue to celebrate the relationship that has existed between our two places, as well as the diplomatic gestures and exchanges and the gifting that was so very critical to these relationships from, very different parts of the world. And so, yeah, with that, I would like to just, thank Alice for this invitation, and thank you to the British Museum for both organizing the exhibition and inviting Kate and I here tonight to be able to talk more deeply on these portraits.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Aloha and Kate, for this fascinating presentation. I mean, I think this topic, we could go on and on. Portraiture and expressions of diplomacy in Hawaii runs deep, as we've seen throughout this presentation. It was really good to see the portrait of Kamehameha and the red vest in that context, a portrait that's also depicted on one of our panels, actually, in the exhibition. But also see how the ali'i were depicted going abroad in that connection with Kaiana going to China. And so just absolutely wonderful to see that running across these expressions of sovereignty and of identity for Hawaii. And I guess, I'm just reflecting on this. I'm really excited to see the portraits being centered in our exhibition. It's been such a pleasure to work with the team here and with our stewardship group, or people who helped us co-create and shape this exhibition, and our many contributors to the catalog as well. So again, thank you very much, and many thanks to our audience. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. We're really excited to welcome you at the British Museum for you to experience those portraits in the space, as well as, pieces of featherwork that we were mentioning in the talk as well, and many other Hawaiian ancestral treasures and works, as well as contemporary works by contemporary artists, which includes portraiture as well, contemporary portraiture. So please do come see the exhibition. And yeah, it is a goodbye from the British Museum in London. A goodbye for now, but see you soon.